we can relax and let the story take us away. Chapter 3. The Offer. Isabel returned from another long day of searching for work, but nobody seemed willing to hire someone like her, who was skilled only in household chores. Downhearted, she trudged home with the burdens of rejection slumped on her shoulders. As the late afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Isabel decided to visit the small clinic where her mother had been temporarily confined. She took a deep breath and smiled, hoping to bring some comfort and cheer to Teresa. Isabel entered her mother's room quietly, with the soft rustling of her skirts the only sound. Teresa stirred as her eyes opened slowly. She immediately shifted and smiled to the sight of her daughter. "Good evening, Mother," Isabel whispered, leaning down to kiss Teresa's forehead. Teresa spoke weakly. "Good evening, my dear. How did your day fare?" "I managed," Isabel replied in her gentle voice. "How do you feel?" "A bit better," Teresa said, her voice still frail, but very tired. Isabel nodded. "You must rest and regain your strength. The physician said you need to stay here for a few more days." As the two conversed, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Hawthorne entered with a warm smile, carrying a basket. "Good evening, Teresa, Isabel," she greeted them. "I thought I would bring some fresh fruits and a bit of news." "Good evening, Mrs. Hawthorne," Isabel replied, rising to take the basket from her. "Thank you for your kindness." "It is my pleasure," Mrs. Hawthorne said, setting the basket down. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thanks to all of you," Teresa replied. "Your kindness has been a blessing." "We are a community," Mrs. Hawthorne said warmly. "We look out for each other. Isabel, if you need anything, do not hesitate to ask." Isabel thought for a while, remembering Mrs. Hawthorne's words. "Actually," she said with a hopeful tone, "what news do you bring?" Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes sparkled. I received a letter from an old friend who still works at the palace. They are in need of new maids, and I thought of you, Isabel. With your skills and demeanor, you would be perfect for the position." Isabel felt a spark of hope as she asked, "The palace?" "Truly." "Indeed," Mrs. Hawthorne confirmed, handing Isabel the letter. "My friend has assured me that they are looking for diligent and trustworthy individuals. You would have a chance to earn a good wage and provide for your mother." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes as she looked at her mother. "Mother, do you hear this? It is an opportunity we cannot miss." But Teresa's smile instantly faded, replaced with a look of concern. "The palace is a place fraught with risks, Isabel. The nobles can be unforgiving, and a mistake might have severe consequences, even the loss of one's life." Isabel's enthusiasm dimmed as she considered her mother's words. "But Mother, what choice do we have? This opportunity could save us." Her mother sighed as her eyes were filled with worry. "I know, my dear, but the palace is a different world. You are innocent and kind-hearted, qualities that might not protect you there. I fear for your safety." Yet, Mrs. Hawthorne interjected gently. "Teresa, I understand your fears, but Isabel is strong and capable. She will learn and adapt. The palace can be daunting, but it also offers a chance for a better life." Isabel nodded and took her mother's hand. "Mother, I promise to be careful. I will do my best to learn quickly and avoid mistakes. This is our chance, and I am willing to take the risk for us." Teresa looked deeply into Isabel's eyes, seeing the determination there. After a moment, she nodded reluctantly. "Very well. If you believe this is the right path, I shall support you, but promise me you will be cautious." "I promise, Mother," Isabel said, squeezing her hand. "I will be careful." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled with relief, evident in her eyes. "You are a devoted daughter, Isabel. Your mother is fortunate to have you. Remember, you are not alone. We are here to help." And so Mrs. Hawthorne leaned forward, while her voice took on a tone of urgency as she began discussing the details. "Dear, you must seize this opportunity. Tomorrow, you must present yourself at the palace with this letter," Mrs. Hawthorne instructed, handing Isabel the parchment bearing the official seal. Isabel's heart fluttered with excitement and apprehension as she accepted the letter. But what should I say? How should I present myself? Mrs. Hawthorne smiled reassuringly. "You need only show them the letter. It is an invitation to work as a maid at the palace. They will guide you from there." Isabel nodded as she listened intently. "And what about my mother?" "I will stay with her," Mrs. Hawthorne assured her. "You focus on securing the position. We shall manage things here." Gratitude flooded Isabel's heart as she realized the depth of Mrs. Hawthorne's support. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne. I shall not forget your kindness." "It is my pleasure, Isabel," Mrs. Hawthorne said, patting her hand. "Now, pack your things and rest well tonight. Tomorrow is a new beginning for you." Chapter 4. Journey to the Palace. Isabel's point of view. The next morning, I woke early and dressed carefully. I chose my best attire and packed my few belongings into a small bundle. Today was the day I would travel to the palace, carrying the letter that could change mine and my mother's lives. With my bundle in hand, I made my way to the small clinic where my mother was recovering. As I approached the room, I saw Mrs. Hawthorne already there, attending to Mother with her usual kindness. Despite all the hardships we had faced, I couldn't help but feel the overwhelming gratitude. Even in these dire circumstances, we were blessed to have people like Mrs. Hawthorne who cared about us and were willing to help. "Good morning," I greeted softly, stepping inside. Mrs. Hawthorne looked up and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Isabel. You look ready for your journey." "I am," I replied, though my voice trembled slightly. I turned to my mother, who was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than before. "Mother, I came to say goodbye before I leave," I said, and took her hand in mine. She squeezed my hand, while her eyes were filled with both pride and concern. "My dear Isabel, the day has come. I know this opportunity is important, but the palace is a world so different from ours." "I understand, Mother," I replied, as I kept my voice steady with determination. "But I must do this for us. This opportunity could be the chance we need to change our lives." Mother sighed with her eyes softening. "I know, my dear. Just promise me you will be careful and wise in your actions. The palace can be treacherous for those who do not tread carefully." "I promise, Mother," I said, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "I will be cautious and mindful of everything I do, and I will come back to visit you as soon as I can." Mrs. Hawthorne stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on my mother's shoulder. "Do not worry, Teresa. I will look after you while Isabel is away. We shall manage together." Mother nodded, grateful for the support of her friend. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne. Your kindness means so much to us." Finally, I stood up, took a deep breath, and gathered all my courage. "I must go now. The journey to the palace will take some time." Mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Go with my blessing, my dear. You have always been my strength. May fortune favor you and keep you safe." I gave her one last hug, trying to keep my tears to myself, and held her close for a moment longer. "I will make you proud, Mother. I promise." "You already have," she whispered. As I finally pulled away from the hug, I could see the tears welling in her eyes. It was a moment filled with emotion, and I felt my heart twist painfully in my chest. I gave both her and Mrs. Hawthorne a respectful bow before walking out of the clinic, knowing I was leaving behind the two people who cared for me the most. When I made my way, the reality of my departure hit me hard. My eyes stung with unshed tears as I stepped onto the path leading to the palace. I had no means to pay for a carriage or a horse, so I began the long walk with only my thoughts for company. Each step seemed heavier than the last, laden with my burdens and my worries and fears. While I trudged along, I couldn't help but think if I was making the right decision. I thought if it was right to leave my mother when she needed me the most. But then, the thought of my mother lying in that clinic bed, with her face pale and drawn but still managing a brave smile for my sake, and Mrs. Hawthorne, who had always been there for us, willing to offer help and support without hesitation, woke me up from my own cowardness. They believed in me, and that belief was a lifeline I clung to. The path ahead was uncertain and filled with potential dangers. The palace was a world unknown to me, a place of grandeur, but also of hidden perils. I worried about making mistakes, about failing, but I pushed those fears aside. This journey was not just for me. It was for my mother, for our future. And so, as the towering walls of the palace finally came into view in the distance, my heart swelled with both anxiety and hope. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and continued on. No matter what awaited me behind those grand walls, I was ready to face it. Chapter 5. The Little Kitten. Isabel's Point of View. Then, as I finally arrived and stood in front of the palace gates, I was struck by the sight of a long line of maidens, each holding a letter identical to the one Mrs. Hawthorne had given me. My heart sank slightly as I realized that they, Tuzosuro, were here seeking work, each one probably with a story similar to mine, a family to support, or dreams of a better life. The grandeur of the palace loomed before us. Its tall gates and imposing walls were the very contrast to the humble homes we had left behind. I clutched my letter tightly, feeling both nervous and determination. The other maidens in line looked just as apprehensive, their faces mirroring the same blend of hope and anxiety that I felt. I couldn't help but wonder about their stories. Were they also daughters of struggling families, sent here with the hope of securing a stable income? Did they also have loved ones depending on them, waiting anxiously for good news? The thought made me feel kinship with these strangers, united by our shared purpose. As I waited my turn, I took in the scene around me. The palace guards stood by the gates, their expressions stern but not unkind. Beyond the gates, the courtyard bustled with activity. Servants hurried about, tending to their duties with practiced efficiency. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers and freshly cut grass, which was also different from the smoky, cramped atmosphere of the slums. A few of the maidens glanced at me and offered tentative smiles. I returned their smiles, feeling a bit of comfort, despite the fact that we were also, in a way, competitors. When it was finally my turn, I stepped forward and presented my letter to the guard. He glanced at it briefly before nodding and directing me inside. My heart pounded as I crossed the threshold into the palace grounds, a step that felt like crossing into a new chapter of my life. Then, as I finally walked into the palace courtyard, I saw a woman standing there with a stern look on her face. She was dressed in the formal attire of a senior maid, but her bearing and demeanor suggested she held a position of authority, likely the head housekeeper. She seemed to be around my mother's age, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that she might be as kind and understanding as my mother. However, that hope was quickly dashed when she began to speak. "Welcome to the palace," she said, her voice crisp and unyielding. "I am Mrs. Eliza, the head housekeeper. You are here because you seek employment, but know that not all of you will be chosen. We expect the highest standards of conduct and work ethic here." Her gaze swept over us, her chill run down my spine as her eyes met mine, holding for just a fraction longer than was comfortable. The palace is not a place for the weak or faint-hearted, Mrs. Eliza continued, while her tone left no room for argument. You will be tested, and only those who prove themselves capable will be allowed to stay. Do not think for a moment that this will be easy. It made me swallow hard. My earlier confidence wavered under her scrutiny. The other maidens around me shifted uneasily, clearly feeling the same weight of expectation. Follow me, Mrs. Eliza commanded, turning on her heel and leading us deeper into the courtyard. We trailed behind her, our footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. As we walked, I couldn't help but steal glances at the grandeur around me, the well-tended gardens, the intricate stonework of the palace walls, the uniformed servants going about their duties with precision. It was a world so different from anything I had known, both beautiful and intimidating. We were led to a large, airy room that served as the maids' quarters. Mrs. Eliza turned to face us once more, her expression as stern as ever. You will be assigned tasks and observed closely, she said. Show diligence and competence, and you may earn a place here. Fail, and you will be dismissed without hesitation. Now, go to your assigned rooms and prepare. The work begins at first light. With that, she handed out slips of paper to each of us, detailing our room assignments. As I took mine, I felt relieved and yet anxious. This was just the beginning, and already I could sense the challenges ahead. I found my assigned room and stepped inside. I took a moment to gather my thoughts. The room was small but neat, with a simple bed and a chest for my belongings. I set my bundle down and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling everything finally settle on my shoulders. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath while thinking of my mother.